Okay, well, the corridor was clear, so I think this is probably all of us. So thank you for coming to my very unpopular session on modularity. So where we want to go is I'll whiz through quickly what's going to happen. We'll talk about philosophy because that's always important. Then about the implications that's had for modularity in FOLIO, what the benefits are of the modular architecture, how you get an ecosystem of modules, and some light technical details. And then with that background, we'll look at the actual case study, which is mod reporting, and finish with some implications. And I always like, if I can, to start with G.K. Chesterton, who I think has combines wit and genuine wisdom like nobody else I know. And in one of his Father Brown stories about a Catholic priest who moonlights as a criminal investigator, we get this little bit of dialogue. "I'm afraid I'm a practical man," said the doctor with gruff humour, "and I don't bother much about philosophy." "You will never be a practical man until you do," said Father Brown. And Chesterton's very strong on this kind of thing. In a lot of his writings, the idea comes up that unless you have a fixed philosophy in mind and you know where you're trying to get to, it's useless to talk about progress, because progress then can only mean moving around at random. But for progress to be progress, it must be towards a fixed idea, which is your philosophical position. And FOLIO arose from a philosophy. If you were around back in the early days, a lot of it was very much Sebastian Hammer's mind. And it begins with the idea that communities tend to do things better than top-down organizations do. And the things that they do better can include ILSs, where rather than getting the ILS that you're given by your vendor, you get to help build it. But I think it's not just that communities do things better. I think that communities do better things. So in other words, it isn't just that working as a community, rather than taking what we're given, we can get where we're going with more efficiency, but we can actually go to better places. And a key part of that is the idea that FOLIO belongs not to a vendor, not even index data, not EBSCO, but to the community. And that any member of the community, in principle, should be in a position to contribute in many different kinds of ways. Now, we know there are practicalities, but this is the way it ought to be. So what it adds up to is that there is no special access for insiders, at least from a technical perspective. What I mean is that the fact that certain people were involved in the early design of FOLIO doesn't give those people any advantages in coding against it. They work in exactly the same way as everybody else. And we'll look at what that way is as we proceed. So the reason then that modularity is such a big deal in FOLIO, and especially such a big deal to me, and why this is positioned as a technical talk, but you could almost think of it as a sermon, and it's why it's so often my topic, is that modularity is the concrete manifestation of the philosophical proposition that FOLIO is owned by a community and can contribute. So that's why from the very start, it was constructed to be modular. Modules, if you like, you could say they're the unit of contribution. Now, that's not true, of course, because there are many ways of contributing that aren't to do with code. So everything SMEs do to contribute towards the design, people's work in documentation in other areas, reviewing other people's code. So it would probably be truer to say that modules are sort of the unit of owned contribution. So if you make a thing and bring it to the community to become part of FOLIO, then that thing is likely to be a module. So when you want to say, here's the thing we've made, use this in your FOLIO system, that's the form it takes. So I want to super briefly review, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but review the shape of the architecture of FOLIO. At the heart of it is Okapi, which is the API gateway. All access to any FOLIO functionality comes through this gateway. Its job is to manage modules. And the second really important component of the architecture is very well-defined specifications for what it means to be a module. And we'll discuss those a little more as we go on. And then the third thing is just a handful of modules that we think of as being the core, and that they're to do with things like how you authenticate, how you demonstrate that you're authorized to run other modules. And that really is the whole thing. You could, in a sense, you could say that is FOLIO. And all the stuff that's involved in running a library, it is just modules that run on Folio. It gives you a context where any module can be run, whatever source it comes from. So here's how that looks. To a librarian who isn't thinking in these terms, Folio is just a user interface, and that's the way it should be, of course. Not everybody should have to think about all these details. Below that is always Okapi, and Okapi works by talking to a back end, which here is illustrated as an empty box. And those core modules we talked about are just 4 modules that run in that box and have no more privileges and no more special access to any facilities than any other module. And then what happens is you fill in the box with other modules of your own. My app, and indeed your app, will run in Folio, and that's what gives you something that's actually of value. So the UI also is modular, but that's not what this talk is about. So we'll skip over user interface modules and just talk about the ones in the back end. So why do I keep going on about this? Why is this vision so important? It's because the modularity lowers or even removes, in some senses, the bar to participation. If you want to put new functionality into Alma or Voyager, that simply is not an option that's available to you. With Folio, that's not true. You can add a new module, which you can create yourself. Individual libraries can produce the modules that they need, or probably more realistically, in many cases, hire developers to do it. Or even crowdfund development, which is an idea that's cropped up a couple of times actually this week. And crucially, different libraries can deploy different sets of modules so that you can lower operating costs by only running the parts of the whole big Folio that you need. In the very early days of this, we used to half-jokingly refer to Folio as a DLS, a disintegrated library system. Yeah, I really like it. I'm just a bit of a shame that fell by the wayside. And crucially, none of this needs anyone's permission from a central authority to create a new module, to drop one you don't want from your Folio instance. There is nobody who's in a position to say no to you in doing that.
Wait. The TC reviews.
Right. So when I say to add a module to your Folio, I do mean your Folio. If you want to add it to a Flower release, then absolutely there are rightly procedures that need to be gone through and quality gates and vetting. But if you're a library running Folio and you want to add a module to it, nobody can say no to that. Or at least nobody outside your organization. So the idea here is that we're building an ecosystem of modules as we go. An example might be a library that decides it needs a module for booking rooms to make sure that people can have meetings without colliding with other people. Weirdly, we seem to need one of those for booking Zoom rooms, which you would think would not be a scarce resource, but there you go. So that library could create the module itself and then make it available for other Folio libraries to use. And this sounds like a kind of a too good to be true story, but in fact, it's exactly what happened with course reserves. Now, that was a facility that in the early days of Folio, not many libraries seemed very excited about. And there was no sense of it being core to the roadmap of things that were developed. But it happened that the Fenway Library Organization, which is one of our customers, really did want course reserves. So they funded the development of that facility that got contributed back to Folio. And as a result, it now seems pretty much every US academic library that's running Folio is using the course reserves module. And that really is it's a vision of a beautiful future, I think. And it's part of why, despite the many frustrations of working in Folio, it does remain something that's really close to my heart and that I feel kind of evangelistic about. So remember, Folio's technical design was started in 2015. We were in St. Martin in the Caribbean. This is what it looked like from outside. This is what it looked like where the work was done. We all crowded into Sebastian's hotel room and hardly breathed the fresh air at all. But that was 2015. The first modules for Folio came in 2016. I checked the Git commit histories. So mod users and mod inventory in 2016. That's 8 years ago. It's not long. How many modules do you think run on the back end now?
Very bad.
114 in the snapshot build when I checked it this morning. So, and they cover such a wide range of different things. And I quite like the fact that a lot of them, I have no idea what they are. Because that's the idea, right? I don't need to know it's someone else's module.
Yeah.
You could say that no real deployed folio probably would include all of those modules. I hope they don't. They're all in snapshot because that's what snapshot is there for. So I love the fact that in 8 years, a community has put together that number of modules without needing some central committee to provide guidance about each individual one of them. Obviously, there is guidance on where's the roadmap, where we're trying to move folio to, but that's a facility that's provided that guidance rather than being a restriction that's imposed. Quick sidebar, how the modules become available to the community. And if you're a library and you see that I produced a room booking module and you want to use it, how can you trust that module? I'm not going to talk about that. But I'll be very happy to if there's time at the end when we get to questions. So I just want to acknowledge that it's a real issue and that there are some ways to think about that. All right, light technical details. What actually is a folio module? How do you make one? It's a computer program, runs on a computer and fulfills certain requirements. And it's that straightforward. So it happens, for example, that we often run them in containers, but there's nothing about a folio module that requires that. The requirements are just, they're small. So for example, there's no requirements about what language a module must be written in. Because of the availability of tooling and the culture of some of the companies that have been working on folio, it turns out a lot of them are written in Java, but some are written in Node, which is a dialect of JavaScript. At least one is written in Go. I heard today of a module written in Python. The very first ever folio module was written in Perl, if you remember that. Yeah, it was mod hello, I think, and it would just reply hello world. So what must a folio module be then if so much is wide open to it? Well, it's got to respond to web service application programming interface requests. So all that means is it's got to take a request like give me a list of users and respond to those requests through a web port. Typically, those APIs are defined in a way that is RESTful. That is, they're to do with addressing particular objects. So you could say, get me this user, change the details about this user, create a new user, those kinds of things. But it need not be that way. Typically, the payloads are defined in the JSON meta format, but in fact, it's perfectly possible if you are perverse enough to write a module that responds in XML or something else instead. We don't advise it, again, because so much of the tooling is set up to work with JSON, but there's not an inherent requirement of a module.
ui-ldp does that.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Because that's what the format is.
Well, I mean, my guess was it would have transliterated it into JSON, but I'm really pleased to find it doesn't. I like that this polyglot quality is there in real life. Here's the key point, and if you like this bullet point that's just come up, I would say at the kind of core of what I have to say here. The thing that makes a folio module is that it provides a machine-readable description of the requests that it accepts and the responses that it gives. And that's what makes it possible for Okapi to know how to deal with it, what messages to forward to it rather than to another module, and gives you ways of dealing coherently with the responses. That machine-readable description is called a module descriptor. And the critical thing that it must specify, there's a lot of other stuff it specifies. It's got the name of the module, it can have a human-readable description, it can define permissions, but the heart of it is just this. It says, these are the interfaces that this module requires, and it lists a bunch of interfaces just by their names, short names, and an optional version number. And it describes which interfaces it provides. And those descriptions are a little more detailed. We'll see an example of one shortly. So the point I want to make really clear here is all communication between folio modules is through those interfaces that are declared and which are sort of a matter of public record. There is no shared database in a folio system. Now, Mike, are you lying when you say there's no shared database? I am lying because it happens that nearly all folio modules keep data in Postgres, and we use the same Postgres instance for all the modules in a folio installation. But in fact, there's no requirement that it should be so. If I want to write a folio module that stores its data in MongoDB or DBM even, then I can do that and everything will work just fine. In fact, if I want to use Postgres, which is using a different instance of Postgres from the one the rest of my folio is on, I can do that too. Why would you want to do that, Mike? To prove a point. So, all of the dependencies, again, this is critical, are expressed not in terms of what modules something depends on, but what interfaces they depend on. I shall wait while you take a photo.
Yes.
So again, an interface is a machine-readable description that says, here are the things that make up this interface, that if you invoke these methods, then a module that implements this interface will be able to do them. So here's an example. This one is from mod-ldp, which is a module that provides information from a reporting database and makes it available for the user interface and therefore the reporting app. So here's how it begins. It gives the identifier of the module, called of the interface, sorry. This interface is called LDP query. It's at version 1.2. And it provides a whole bunch of handlers, of which I've eliminated almost all, just so that the font is big enough to read. But each description of a handler takes the same format. It says what the method is, what path it's on, and which permissions you need. So this interface is a promise that if I use an HTTP GET on /ldp/db/log, that provided I have the permission ldp.read, then I will get back a log. And there's a description of the format of, or at least the meta format of that log. So that's an interface, a concrete example of an interface. And because things are done that way, the folio architecture enforces its philosophy, this partitioning of concerns. So modules that integrate together do so by the contract defined by the interfaces. They, again, no shared database. My module can't look at your database's data, not just because it would be rude to do so, but because it doesn't even know what database your data is in. For all I know, you're keeping your data in a DBM file. There's no way for me to get at it. And that's a really good thing, because it means that we keep honest, we keep using only the ways of working that are defined and freely available. So if I consume the interface of your module, if I use the mod-wane module, which declares that it implements the wane interface, then I don't know what that module is doing to fulfill the requests I make, but I also don't even know what module it is. So it's perfectly possible that Scott will write a new module of his own that also provides the wane interface, that module will be deployed in the version of Folio I'm using, and my client code will still invoke the same interface, not even knowing that the implementation is different. So multiple modules can and do provide alternative implementations of the same interface. So finally, with all that background, which ended up being rather more than I intended, we come to the case study. Yeah. Oh, good. So mod reporting. So this is the reporting application. I know at least two people in this audience are extremely familiar with it because they demonstrated it on the first day of the conference.
You have more on soon.
Yeah. Oh, that's nice to know. So here is mod reporting. It's providing the ability to put together through a form a sort of SQL-like query that will be submitted to the reporting database. And here is the result of executing such a query. So this is not data from the Folio database, but from the reporting database. Now, don't need to look at that. So there's the user interface components of the reporting app. But what sits underneath that and provides the data to it is also indispensable. That's mod-ldp. So you remember its job is to accept requests in a defined format from the user interface and then go off and do some mysterious thing on the back end that involves referencing a reporting database. That's mod-ldp. And so back to our old friend, this diagram here, all that's going on is mod-ldp is one of the modules that's deployed, and it happens that out the back it's talking to MetaDB, the reporting database. Okay, now mod-ldp is bad. It's bad for a lot of reasons. Partly just the fact that it's old code. Unfortunately, we live in a world now where code decays over time as dependencies age out and things get deprecated. It was written by somebody who is no longer on the FOLIO project and hasn't been for a long time. So the knowledge that went into building that has kind of left our orbit. That person used tools that are not really familiar to those of us who are on the project. So it's difficult for us to maintain. Our understanding of the code shows that it's not good on keeping tenants separate. So if you're running a multi-tenant FOLIO system with mod-ldp, things might happen that you do not expect. There are places where it's insecure. All in all, it's badly in need of updates. And there comes a point, of course, in any program's life where it becomes simpler just to throw it away and build a new one. So our conclusion in this case was that the unsupported and poorly understood and insecure mod-ldp would be better replaced by a new module, which we call mod reporting, which is written in the Go language. And by the way, I found that very pleasant to work with.
Ah, good.
Yeah. So who would like to see the interface definition that mod reporting provides? Here it is. Now, you may find that it looks spookily familiar. Let's take a trip back in time, shall we? To about 5 or 6 minutes ago in this very talk, when we were looking at the interface description from mod-ldp. I'm going to switch between those two. Okay, you ready? Here it goes. There's the mod reporting interface. Now, the eagle-eyed among you might have spotted that they are exactly the same, and they are exactly the same. And that's critical because what it means is that mod reporting is providing and advertising that it provides the LDP query interface. Now, the user interface that they're reporting at calls in using that interface. It's a shame that we have two different meanings of the word interface. And I'm going to say UI instead of user interface. So the UI makes its calls according to this LDP query interface. It doesn't know that mod reporting has replaced mod-ldp. Again, the UI not only doesn't care, it doesn't even know, and it can't know. Roughly speaking, it has no way to know. And it's exactly because the new module provides the same interface as the old. It is plug compatible. So we did deploy it in place of its predecessor. It went just fine. There were no problems at all, which was gratifying to find that what was true in theory was true in practice. And of course, there have been absolutely no changes to the UI. So here we see a screenshot from FOLIO snapshots from earlier today. And the things I want to draw your attention to, well, it's this. It's that it's running mod reporting and not mod-ldp. And happily, nobody knew that that change had taken place outside of a couple of ops people who actually made it happen. So this is the regular FOLIO snapshot. It's not some test system. It's just seamlessly slid in underneath, which is as it should be. So I'm glad that we've had that experience of demonstrating that this works as it ought to. And I think it gives quite a nice example of how that sort of code upgrade can be performed. Because the new module is radically different from the old. It's in a different programming language for one thing. It's much shorter. It's much more rigorous about tenant separation. And yet it's implementing the same interface. So it just slips in as if by magic. So this approach provides, among other things, a pathway to refresh the parts of FOLIO that start to age out over time. So I think there are a couple of other modules out there that people are not super happy with the current implementations. They can just be replaced as necessary over time, rather than needing some kind of giant flag day where everything changes all at once. I mean, I don't envy ex libris when the time comes that they feel they need to replace Elm. I think it's going to be a much more frightening process. Now, the same technical approach can also be done to achieve a rather different thing. So in this case, we replace mod-ldp with mod reporting that provides exactly the same behavior. But what you can also do is provide different behavior that's behind the same interface. Let me give you an example. We have mod users, which maintains the user register for FOLIO. And when you look up who is the user Mike, it's mod users that comes back with the answer that is Mike Taylor and mike@indexdata.com. But your institution might use some other source of truth for authentication. You might have an LDAP directory, or as it now turns out, more appositely, you might be using keycloak for this, which is what's happening in the Eureka architecture. So the magical thing here is that you can just replace the old mod users with a new bit of software that works by reference to that other form of user storage, again, without anything changing higher up. Or another example would be there's the lists app that some libraries are finding quite useful. We could, at least in theory, write a plug-compatible replacement for mod-fqm-manager, which is what lists uses to query the FOLIO database. And we could have that search in a proper reporting database, such as MetaDB, so that we're able to provide the same functionality in the lists app, but by reference to a reporting database. And the thing I only found out today, which I'm really pleased about, is that this is exactly what is happening in Eureka, that mod login, which handles logging in FOLIO, now is being at least optionally replaced by a new module called mod login keycloak, which implements the same interface as mod login. So it turns out that there are two case studies that could have been presented today in this talk. And you got the one that I know more about, but if we got Craig McNally in here, he could have talked to you about mod login keycloak. But again, critically, I want to make the point that anyone can do this. Now, the two examples were just shown. One was done by Index Data, and we were at the core of the early days of FOLIO. One was done by EBSCO, who are even more core to the way FOLIO is going these days. But it didn't need to be us. Anybody else could have done this. Why? Again, because of the interfaces defining a plug-compatible service. So really, I just finished, as I started with a philosophical statement, I want to finish with a philosophical statement, which is that this kind of modularity ultimately is empowering for institutions for sure, but also even potentially for individuals. It's not hard to imagine someone like Demian Cax, for example, who fired up Viewfind on his own as a one-man project fundamentally. I'm not saying he didn't have any help, but the core of it was one person. And similarly, it's perfectly possible for one person to throw together or carefully craft a FOLIO module that ends up becoming a much loved and significant part of the ILS. Power to the people.
All right.
Well, thank you. Yes, questions?
Yes, I do have. So, what, in your view, could we as a community do to manage some of the out-of-band communication that goes on right now by posting Kafka messages and having them be picked up by modules? And right now that's not documented in a module descriptor. It's not officially part of an interface.
So you're talking about Kafka events?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a really good question. So it turns out, arguably, I was lying again earlier when I said all FOLIO interactions come through Okapi. I wish that it was so, and we do actually have a mod. What was it called? The event manager mod
For what?
for handling asynchronous events, such as the mod.
Well, they have a pumps up here.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, it's still there.
Yeah, but it's not used, is it? So it is also true that some modules pick up events from a Kafka bus so that they can be notified asynchronously that other things have changed. What can be done about that? I would say the best answer would be that we should never have done that at all. And instead, all our use of Kafka should have gone through a proper FOLIO module. But given that we are where we are, and a fair few modules now use Kafka events, then I think the answer would be to extend the format of an interface in the module descriptor so that as well as describing WS API paths, it can also describe expected Kafka events. Were there any questions on the Zoom?
No.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
So I got to ask, how do recap all this new work defined by what's the team called? Whatever.
Yeah.
And modularity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one answer to that is Eureka works because of modularity. So the example we gave where authentication via keycloak is implemented by mod-login keycloak that's plug compatible with mod-login. The team responsible for Eureka have made quite a lot of promises about backwards compatibility and maintaining the way that things work. So assuming all that pans out as it ought, it should remain possible to plug modules into the Eureka version of what's currently Okapi without needing to make any changes to how that's done. And that really is, I suppose, it's the acid test of whether Eureka keeps its promises, whether we can still do that. Other thoughts? All right, well, I can just let everybody go early. Or I could just talk a little bit about ecosystems of modules, if that's of interest. Sharon?
I do have a thought. Early on, when things were getting developed, I remember having a talk with folks about data warehouse, data lake technology, and how making sure that your reporting environment can pull together data from all these different modules and make sense of it.
Right.
Kind of it sort of imposes an additional restriction on the sort of, anyone can develop a module. Because if you don't keep that in mind, then, how do we have data integrity?
Yeah.
And I just wonder how that plays into what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think the MetaDB design is very good on that. So although we usually talk of it being for analytics on FOLIO and particularly the sort of the FOLIO Postgres database, configuration of MetaDB is by creating a bunch of connectors to various sources. And it just happens that the number of such connectors is typically one. But it's perfectly possible to have one of the connectors going off and pulling data from a MongoDB database or a separate Postgres database or whatever else it might be. And one thought that's occurred to me is the Solr database that people use for their ViewFind discovery tools. We could bring that into MetaDB as well and potentially run analytics that combine or compare the data from the Folio ILS and the discovery system. So there's a lot of flexibility there.
So having the data, doesn't having the data in all those different structures require more of the extract, transform, load process if it's not coming from JSON or, if it's something different from what we know right now?
Yeah, so something would need to be done if, for example, my hypothetical module was storing XML in MongoDB. Then the connector that fetches that data would also have to do some kind of extraction. Yeah. But then that's true already. The current connectors do extraction from JSON into a relational form. So it's just more of the same kind of coding.
I think Owen is feeling that his module being designed a little bit differently than the
Sorry?
I think what Sharon's referring to is that the data structures in the ERM modules have to be very different from the data structures.
Right. So early on, a lot of the Folio modules were built using RMB tooling, the Random Module Builder. And so they tended to have similar kind of structures for their database. the ERM code was written largely by knowledge integration using their own data storage toolkits. And that's why it has different structures. But ultimately, when it comes into MetaDB, it all just gets translated into columns in a table. So I don't, unless you know differently, it doesn't impose any difficulties in reporting.
It was not possible in LDP, yeah,
Yeah,
but it has been done for the DB.
yeah, we had to wait.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All those functions.
So- I'm just sort of, from that perspective, rather than back engineering, or going, oh, I wish we had done this differently. I just wonder if we need sort of a checklist of things to think about when you're developing your module, how it's going to affect people on the back end,
Yeah.
later downstream.
Yeah. And I think, it would be useful to write that checklist out explicitly, but I think it's sort of there implicitly in people's minds. So it's part of the reason why, in practice, people do tend to use the main FOLIO database rather than some other kind of data store, is partly so that this kind of thing just works. All right, shall we take a slightly early end to the proceedings? Well, thank you all for coming. It's, Yes, thank you everybody online. If anyone online has a question or comment, this is the last chance to bring it up. Okay. All right, thank you and good night.
Thank you.